If a number of people would have said of her, "She seems to me a bit mad," nobody, oddly enough, would have dreamed of saying, "She even imagines she has a son." Carson had come to suspect, indeed, that Robin was sometimes regarded as one of the poor woman's anchoring sanities, a sober reality protecting her from afar from going further round the bend. Of course, Carson knew, nobody brooded very much over him and his wife in their private lives. He was himself prominent, even perhaps a shade notorious in his own sphere. But apart from that, and having neither gift nor apparent desire for intimacy of any sort, the couple were no more than acquaintances of virtually anybody in the land. Lunches here and dinners there, that was about it. And this affected Carl Carson's manner of coping with the Robin business. On the fairly frequent occasions when, so to speak, the myth directly challenged him, he simply went along with it. Unemphatically, yet without reservation, he acknowledged his son, confident that nobody would be sufficiently interested in this absentee to pursue inconvenient curiosities. It was a little different with his wealth, since here people were inquisitive. Of course, his wealth existed, but it irked him a little that it had to be exhibited to the world through, as it were, a magnifying glass of superficial opulence, as in the appointments of his wife's table, the Rolls-Royce in his garage, the pictures that hung on a confidential hire and insure basis on his walls. There were, of course, people who knew that on Carl Carson the touch of Midas had been no more than skin deep, that he thought of pounds and dollars in their 100,000, even at times their 10,000, rather than in their millions. But such people commonly had their own reasons for refraining from suggesting that Carson was not as solid as Threadneedle Street or Fort Knox. And since, at one time or another, he had put a number of them onto a good thing, he even commanded a certain loyalty among them. They would leave money in some Carson concern a shade longer than was prudent, but only a shade, he had sometimes had occasion to reflect. His was a world in which there had to be limits to what one would do for a chum. He had discovered that during years in New York. It had become even more evident when he had returned to settle in London, or rather to settle here in the country and twice a week be delivered from that Rolls into the London train. "Those Caribbean places must be very jolly," Humphrey Lely said. Lely was some sort of painter whom Cynthia had picked up, and he and his wife were the other guests at the luncheon party. Before sitting down, Carson had shown him a Peter Lely hanging in the room and asked, "Painter an ancestor of yours, eh?" To which his guest had answered, amiably, if incomprehensibly, "No, Dutch blood, I'm afraid. But what about the sitter? One of your ancestors?" As the portrait was of an aristocratic Caroline person with the appearance of emerging in some fatigue from a high-class bawdy house, and as Carl Carson was very evidently what used to be called, rather snobbishly, a new man, Carson hadn't quite known whether to be gratified or not. So there had been a slight awkwardness, which was presumably why Lely had now offered this hearty remark about distant places. Carson became aware that a little scallop of caviar had appeared before him. It probably wasn't quite right, that. Not at lunch. One of Cynthia's all-too-frequent faux pas. He wondered what a faux pas was. Uneasy, he took a consolatory gulp of champagne. Then he wondered about that, too. Perhaps he ought to have said hock. You laid on champagne at garden parties as well as at dinners, but perhaps not at lunch. Not that it mattered a damn. Unimportant people. And he had more urgent things to think about. Soon they might be very urgent indeed. "I'm sure you must be fearfully busy," Cynthia was saying to the painter on an admiring note. "Haven't you been doing a portrait of the Lord Mayor?" "It depends on what you mean." Lely was amused. "Not the Lord Mayor of London, you know. Quite obscure mayors have got themselves lauded recently." "So they have," Cynthia said. "Like bishops," she added brightly. This piece of ignorance produced a moment's silence, briskly broken by Mrs. Lely. Lely's wife, like Appleby's, seemed to be a socially competent woman.